Hello, my name is Yensy Sanchez, and I'll be presenting my project on the moderating role of self-efficacy in the association between children's temperament and externalizing behaviors. So to begin, I think it would be helpful to provide you with a little bit of background on what temperament is. Temperament is an innate quality, and it has been defined as individual differences in behavioral responses to environmental stimuli that are relatively stable across time and context. And many studies have shown that different temperament dimensions substantially influence children's developmental trajectories. And so for this study, we only focused on two temperamental dimensions. The first one I would like to talk about is temperamental impulsivity. Impulsivity is defined as responding to a situation without thinking about how to tailor one's responses to the demands of a context, and has been associated with the development of externalizing symptoms in children. So we believe impulsive children's vulnerability to externalizing behaviors may stem from their inability to problem solve and plan, and their inability to problem solve and plan hinders children from regulating their emotions and behaviors and making calculated decisions. So for example, these children are more likely to enact upon their impulses without thinking when experiencing negative emotions. And in doing so, it puts them at risk for expressing aggression or ODD symptoms. And these are just a few examples here, the pictures of how an impulsive child may look like. And this is a picture of my brother, and he's one of the main reasons for why I wanted to study impulsivity. The second temperament we looked at was behavioral inhibition. Children who are inhibited are characterized as being shy, reticent, cautious, and fearful. And they easily become distressed and have the tendency to withdraw in response to novel environments and unfamiliar people. So then it is this distress that puts inhibited children at risk for developing anxiety and depression. So for example, inhibited children experiencing this fear and stress often have difficulties developing skills for coping with these negative emotions, and their inability to cope may turn into anxiety. So now that you know a little bit more about these two temperaments, I would like to go into why we studied these interactions. I believe it's really important to understand that the presence of impulsivity or behavioral inhibition does not necessarily guarantee the development of psychopathology in children. In other words, just because a child is inhibited or impulsive, it doesn't mean that they're going to experience mental health problems. And so there is this significant variability across children in the risk these two temperamental dimensions pose on their adjustment. That being said, it is very likely that there may be outside sources playing a role in the interruption or moderation of the risk posed by these dimensions to children. Unfortunately, not enough literature or research has explored the resources of variability. And so for this study, we proposed that children's self-efficacy would serve as a protective factor in the prospective associations between children's impulsive or behaviorally inhibited temperaments and subsequent internalizing and externalizing behaviors. This figure here is just a conceptualization of how we believed self-efficacy would interrupt the link between temperament and children's psychopathology. So the reason why we chose self-efficacy is because it has been associated with a decreased risk of experiencing depression, anxiety, withdrawal, or developing disrupted behaviors and aggression. So why does this association exist? Well, to begin with, self-efficacy is defined as a strong conviction of competence based on one's evaluation of various sources and of information about one's abilities, and is essentially the foundation of effective decision-making. In general, children with high self-efficacy have been shown to have confidence to successfully cope with challenges or setbacks, which is why these children are less likely to develop these problems. And as I mentioned earlier, impulsive children have the tendency to lash out and are more likely to deal with conflicting situations inappropriately. However, we believe that self-efficacy would buffer the development of externalizing behaviors by increasing impulsive children's ability to manage socially conflicting situations in a way that would hinder their expression of defiance. Self-efficacy has also been shown or has also been associated with better planning, better problem solving, and self-control, which are important characteristics that unfortunately impulsive children tend to lack. In terms of behaviorally inhibited children, we believed self-efficacy would give them the confidence to expand their comfort zones in ways that offset their tendencies to socially withdraw. And in turn, it would reduce their expression of depression and anxiety. Now I'd like to move on to how we tested this. Data was drawn from a multi-method, multi-informant longitudinal study that consisted of 2 waves. Participants consisted of 243 families. The children participating were on an average age of 4.6 years old. Families were predominantly Black or African American, and the rest were white, multiracial, or another race. The median household was around 36,000 per year, and the majority of families were receiving public assistance. And at wave 1, parents had been living together for about 3.4 years. To measure impulsivity, we obtained observational assessments in multiple tasks that were designed to capture children's inability to regulate their impulses. So for this, we used 3 measures: gift delay, black boxes, and pet tapping. And today I'm only going to talk about gift delay because we don't have a lot of time. But if you have any other questions about the measures, you can ask me at the end. So for the gift delay task, children were presented with a gift and were instructed to refrain from peeking in the bag until after the experimenter retrieved the bow from another room. The wait time was about 3 minutes. And so behaviors within those 3 minutes, such as peeking in the bag, touching the bag, or even pulling the toy out before the experimenter returned, reflected high levels of impulsivity. So basically, coders were trained to specifically look at children's inability to delay gratification and resist temptation to open the gift. This here just gives an example of how an impulsive child may look like during this task. For inhibition, trained observers rated children's inhibition and reticence in 4 different tasks that involved novelty and risk. And those were bear mask, snake in the can, gift delay, and black boxes. These tasks were used to assess how children dealt with unfamiliarity and risk in order to capture individual differences in inhibition. For example, in the bear mask task, an experimenter wore a bear mask and knelt in front of a child for about 30 seconds before taking the mask off. Then the experimenter proceeded to encourage the child to touch the mask or wear it him or herself. And within this interaction, behaviors such as tense body posture, freezing, anxiety, or attentional vigilance in response to the experimenter indicated higher levels of inhibition. Again, because of time, I can't explain all of them, but if you have questions, feel free to ask later. To measure self-efficacy, we use the MacArthur Story Stem Battery. In this task, children heard story stems and were asked to complete the story using toy figures. To assess their self-efficacy, we focused on the competence code, 1 being very incompetent and 7 being very competent. Very competent ratings reflected children's portrayals of themselves as being competent figures in using available resources to manage relationship challenges and stressors in the most effective and resourceful ways, whereas children who saw themselves as very incompetent did not exhibit the ability to manage challenges effectively and were therefore more likely to be susceptible to threat. These pictures here just show the little toys that were used during the task. And to assess children's internalizing and externalizing behaviors, we used teacher reports on children's behaviors. Externalizing behaviors were derived from 3 subscales, which were ADHD, ODD, and conduct problems. Internalizing behaviors were also derived from 3 subscales, which were depression, inhibition, and asocial behavior. We also had 2 covariates, child sex and family annual household income. So to test our hypothesis, we conducted a series of structural equation models to examine the nature of the association between each of the 2 temperamental dimensions, in this case, impulsivity and inhibition, and the development of their later internalizing or externalizing behaviors. For example, this predictor here was either impulsivity or behavioral inhibition, predicting the development of internalizing or externalizing behaviors. For each model, we also tested self-efficacy as moderator of the interaction between these 2 temperaments in the specific psychological problem. So this is self-efficacy. And as you can see, this line here is bolded. It's basically the interaction we were looking at, and the bolded line just means that we expected the interaction to be significant. So looking at results, our results failed to support self-efficacy as moderator of the association between impulsivity and internalizing behaviors, and the associations between behavioral inhibition and internalizing and externalizing behaviors. However, as you can see by this model, this bolded line here indicates that children's self-efficacy significantly moderated the association between impulsivity and children's later externalizing behaviors. To better understand this interaction, we also conducted a simple slope analysis of impulsivity for children high and low in self-efficacy. As you can see by this plot, impulsivity was significantly associated with weight to externalizing problems only for children low in self-efficacy, but not for children high in self-efficacy. So the non-significant association between impulsivity and externalizing problems among children with high self-efficacy suggested that high self-efficacy plays a protective role against further increases in externalizing behaviors. So why was the moderation significant? Well, social cognitive theory states that self-efficacy influences our behaviors and the environments with which we interact by influencing our cognitive processes. And as I mentioned before, cognitive processes that are likely to be inhibited by impulsivity are the ability to plan, problem solve, self-regulate, and decision make. And since studies have shown that self-efficacy influences these cognitive processes, we believe that this may be a possible explanation for the moderation findings in our study. Now I'd like to talk about a few limitations in future directions. So first, we found a weak interaction effect of self-efficacy and inhibition on children's later internalizing behaviors. This may have been due to the sample size being insufficient. So we believe that if the effect stays the same within a bigger sample, the findings may be significant. Another limitation was our approach of rating teacher descriptions of internalizing behaviors. Teachers are not always the best at being aware of children's internalizing behaviors. So in the future, it may be helpful to use other reporters that are more sensitive to internalizing behaviors, such as school counselors. Our study was also not generalizable to other samples, and future research would also benefit from exploring how self-efficacy interacts with other temperament dimensions and their associated risks. So that is the end. I wanted to thank Dr. Davies and Lucia for their mentorship and support and for answering all my questions. Dr. Toth for reading my paper and being my second reader, Dr. Ellenbass and Dr. Fetter for running this program, my friends for helping me with my drafts, and I wanted to thank you for being here and listening to me. Any questions?